Over the years, Candace Owens has said some of the most heinous, vile, denigrating, disparaging, and disrespectful things that any hardcore racist would say about Black people and the Black community. But out of all of the things that she has said, these are the four that really make you want to throw hands. And for all of you that are out there saying that, why is everybody so upset because of Candace Owens' opinion? Here are the worst, in my opinion, of her opinions. And mind you, her opinions are not based on fact and factual statistical data. Her opinions are based on racism and white supremacist ideology. Here's number one.
I'll be having a hearing on white supremacy. We are assuming that the biggest victims of that would be minority Americans. And presumably this hearing would be to stop that and to make sure that we can preserve the lives of minority Americans, which, and based on the hierarchy of what's impacting minority Americans, if I had to make a list of 100 things, white nationalism would not make the list. And we don't see hearings on those bigger issues. You brought up the inner city communities, which is a huge issue. Black on black crime, the breakdown of family, I think is the number one thing that's contributing to that. And we never hear anybody talking about what happens when you remove a father from the home. In fact, I would argue that right now we have a social environment that is hostile towards men and it does not inspire masculinity or being a man and what it means to be a father figure in a household. And black on black crime is a huge issue in America right now, but people don't like to talk about that. It seems as, well, let's talk about the smaller issues and not the big issues that are facing Black America. We saw this same sort of a narrative in 2016 when police brutality became at the forefront of the discussion. And if you were paying attention to politicians, you would have thought that if you were a Black American, you couldn't walk outside without being shot by a police officer, when in fact, you had a higher chance of being struck by lightning as a Black American in 2016 than being shot unarmed by a police officer.
You said it wouldn't make the top 100 of the things that you're concerned about as a Black American, concerned about Black communities in America. What would? You can't rattle off all 100, but at the time I've got 30 seconds.
Father absence, the education system, and the staggering abortion rate.
That was Candace Owens testifying before Congress on what her opinion is more important than racism and white nationalism here in the United States. What's more important and what people don't want to talk about, according to Candace Owens, is black on black crime, immigration, abortion, not the core reasons why these things are problematic. She doesn't really want to get down to the core reasons why these things are problematic. No, she's using her platform, this moment, this time, to advocate for what white supremacists and racists find problematic with the Black community. This is why I say Candace Owens is particularly dangerous to the Black community, because she has the ear of politicians up in Congress. And instead of having a genuine conversation about the issues that affect the Black community, no, she takes that moment to advocate for what racist white people find problematic with the Black community. Here's number two.
So race obsessed. And one thing I always say, Tucker, is that the left can pull a racist narrative from thin air where it doesn't exist, but when it actually is in their face, they try to avoid it at all costs, especially when the perpetrator is a black person against another white person, which obviously happens more often in this country, given the fact that black Americans are the most murderous group in America by rate. Now, what's interesting here is that the two biggest race cases of the last 2 years, arguably George Floyd and Kyle Rittenhouse, never actually produced a single piece of evidence pointing to race, right? George Floyd, Derek Chauvin never used racial language or racial slurs against George Floyd during that arrest. Didn't matter. It became the biggest race case in America. Kyle Rittenhouse, that case had to do with 3 white people. Didn't matter. They extracted a racial narrative for that case.
Yes. Let's continue the racist stereotype that black people are violent. That's what Candace Owens is doing in this particular moment where she's spewing heinous, dehumanizing, disparaging comments about black people. The woman said that black people are the most murderous group in America. Factual statistical data says otherwise. But that's not what Fox News and Candace Owens strives for, to be honest and genuine in discussing these issues. No, in this moment, Candace is attempting to further the racist stereotype that black people are violent. There's more.
Real truth of the reason why people hate the Queen has nothing to do with the colonization. It has something to do, which, by the way, just to be clear, the Brits invading Africa actually represents, and this is going to get me in trouble, but it was, if you look at how forward it brought the African colonies, it ended up being a net positive. Now, this is, of course, it's going to get me in trouble because people somehow think that Africans were living happily ever after and things were great, and then the horrible English, British descended upon and murdered everybody, and the French suddenly murdered everybody, and that just isn't the truth. Obviously, the African nations had slavery, just like the European nations had slavery. So it's an evil that was not started, did not begin in Europe, actually. It can actually be traced back to Muslim origins, and for whatever reason, people have this fantastical rendition of history where they think that it was only white people that ever did anything bad, when in fact the truth is that even in terms of our own history, American history, it was the Africans that were selling the Africans to the Europeans, and usually for things as basic as gin and mirrors. I talk about this in my book. Like, it was at really basic things. And when Europeans set out to end slavery, by the way, it was white men that were the first in the world to abolish the slave trade, right?
Now, we do know that, yes, Africans sold other Africans into slavery. Africans enslaved other Africans. But we know the difference between slavery in Africa and slavery in the United States. Slavery in Africa was more like servitude, and there was an end to it. And it typically was in regards to criminals, right? Slavery in the United States is called chattel slavery, right? There's a difference between the two, but she's not being genuine in discussing this topic. No, she's continuing to feed a narrative to racist white people, right? I mean, let's be real. White people didn't end the slave trade because it was morally wrong. White people, one of the reasons why the slave trade ended was because white people began to breed slaves. That's why the slave trade ended. They didn't want to pay for slaves anymore when they could breed slaves. For the sake of time, because I'm running out of it, here's some honorable mentions. Candace Owens on Black History Month. Pause to read. Candace Owens on reparations for black people. Pause to read. Candace Owens on Juneteenth. Pause to read. Candace Owens on the NAACP. Pause to read. And Candace Owens on DEI. Pause to read. This is why no one should give Candace Owens a pass. She's diabolical. She's a fucking menace. She should be ousted from the black community for eternity. Period.